So I was about to replace part of this grip, and I thought before I do that, I might as well give a little review of this sword before I alter it too much. So this is the Royal Armouries, it's the Windlass 14th century arming sword, which was made as a collaboration with the Royal Armouries and Matt Easton. And it's an exact replica of a sword, the Todo sword, you might refer to it, that's in the Royal Armouries in Leeds. So first, I'm going to talk real quickly about this type of sword and what kind of sword it is, and then I'll get to the review and the issue with the grip. So I'm a big fan of this sword. This is really my favorite type of sword. I was very happy when Windlass made this because swords of this type were really hard to find before, and basically I had only seen very high-end custom replicas, or I think I may have seen one too cheap replica for me to dare trust it. So it's really nice to see something of this quality but affordable as to see a replica of this type of sword, which is, as I said, pretty uncommon. So what is this type of sword? Well, it's a type of it's an oakshot type 14 sword of a peculiar, very elongated type. So it's longer than most type 14 swords, and its profile, therefore, also is a bit more gradually elongated. It's less in terms of its proportions. It's less strikingly wide at the base and kind of short and compact. So this is actually pretty long. The blade is about 85 centimeters, I think, and the total length of the sword is about a meter. What's also unusual about this in terms of a Type 14 sword, other than the length and slenderness, is the fact that this last third after the fuller ends is not of a lenticular section, but actually of a flattened diamond section. So that makes it, I guess, all the more stiff, and it's got an interesting amount of stiffness for such a powerful cutting sword. So this is kind of a perfect middle ground in terms of historical development between the very powerful cut-centric swords of the earlier medieval period, starting with the Dark Age and Viking Age swords, towards the more stiff, rigid, often flattened diamond section, thrust-oriented swords of the later Middle Ages. This is kind of in between, and it's got some really nice compromise features about that. It's absolutely a beastly cutter, which would be, I'm sure, a very effective sword on horseback that can give powerful swings and reach targets that are a decent way away, with powerful cuts even quite far near the tip. But it's also capable of pretty powerful thrusts. It's got a really nice sharp point. So yeah, a really nice compromise. It's also a very nice compromise in terms of how it handles, because although it is a beastly cutter and it is pretty heavy, I think this particular example is around 1,100 grams, I think. So although it can give very powerful cuts, and you can use it, it's very good to use with a big shield, for example, for powerful swings and for reach to be able to get around someone's shield. It's also more nimble than you would think, especially if you would use it in conjunction with a buckler. You can do really a lot of quick disengages, because the dynamic properties of the sword are such that other than being able to do these powerful swings where you keep the momentum of the sword going, you can actually do a lot of small, fine point control work if you don't move the sword around too much, especially with a buckler. And also, for a sword that has a balance point that is quite far from the hand, so here's a trick if you want to find the balance point of an object easily. So long as the friction on both your fingers is similar and on the blade, then if you place your hands apart like this and move them together, whichever finger has the least amount of weight pressing down on it will move toward the center faster because there will be less friction, and that will balance out, and so your fingers will meet exactly at the balance point, which on this sword is, if I remember correctly, about 16, maybe even 17 centimeters in front of the guard. So it balances quite far from the hand, which, in my experience, often makes swords that are not weak in the bind, but that really, when you interact with another blade, they really make the sword want to turn that momentum into these big, wide strikes. Whereas this sword is actually surprisingly strong and sturdy in the bind for interacting with other blades. And that's partially due, I think, to the design of a Type 14 with a wider base here, is that, so swords have two vibration nodes. One of them is usually in the hand, and then one of them is up somewhere here, somewhere around here on this sword. And the thing is, that means that when you are parrying or binding against other blades, in the strong of your blade, if your blade is, so the strong of your blade is going to be a place where your blade is usually relatively wobbly, and that can seriously weaken your binds and parries. And with this wider base, or I suppose if you had a strong distal taper with a thick spine, you could achieve the same sort of thing. It means that the vibration node, so the place that it doesn't wobble in your hand, is sort of drawn out into the blade, if you like. So the base of the blade is relatively stiff, and that makes for a very strong binding capacity down here in the strong of your blade. So that's really nice. So it's really a surprisingly versatile sword, both in terms of its capacity to do damage in terms of cutting and thrusting. It's a very nice compromise in terms of that, but it's also a very nice compromise in terms of how you use it, because it's a very effective sword for big, powerful swings, and, as I said, for more fine binding work and point work. So, oh yeah, last thing about this specific group of swords, of peculiar Type 14 swords. So there's this example in Leeds, but there are a few other examples, one of which is in Solingen. The Solingen one also has a pommel somewhat like this, although it's a bit different. The Solingen one does have a flat on the top here, but this pommel, which might from the side look like a more ordinary disc pommel, really isn't. It's of a very original type and a very appealing shape. So that's it, I guess. Alright, so that's good for the type of sword. Now, what can I say as to this actual replica itself in terms of a review? Well, maybe I'll get straight to the point. Overall, I'm very happy with it. Very happy with the quality for the price, and I've used it for cutting already quite a bit. It's really fantastic. So I've got almost no complaints, but I do have a few things that I have one complaint, and I have a few things to mention that might bother other people, but don't especially bother me. First one is the blade. So the lines of the edges are pretty straight along this direction, but along this direction there is a slight amount of wobble. So actually the edge is almost perfectly straight. So I really can't complain much about that. But what I really wanted to mention here is the wobble in the blade, which I think if I hold it like this you can see. So there's quite a bit of rippling in the blade, which, as I said, really doesn't bother me that much. One consequence of this rippling is that if you look down the sword like this, there are a few asymmetries. So there's a bit of a bump here and a hollow here, and then that gets reversed a bit further down the blade where you have a hollow here and a bump here. So those slight irregularities in the rippling, in the thickness, I don't think they're enough to impact the sword or really weaken the blade in much of any ways. You might actually, I'm not sure, you might see some differences in terms of how it flexes. Actually, while I'm on the topic of flex, it's got an interesting distal taper, so which is well executed overall. So it starts at around 5 millimeters, I think, gradually goes down to, I checked it the other day, I don't remember, 4, 3.5, something like that. It gets, so there's a gradual distal taper till the end of the fuller, but then the fact that it's got a flattened diamond section here means that the blade actually gets somewhat thicker again here before having a gradual distal taper again down to the point. That means that the flexing, it flexes mostly in the second half of the blade, and there's a slight, within that second half of the blade flex, there's a slightly more rigid part here. So there's actually a bit more flex in the end of the fuller than in the beginning of the flattened diamond section. I'm not sure how well you can see that. And what I wanted to say is that the irregular rippling may mean that the flex is slightly different on both sides, but it's really not very noticeable. So not much of a complaint there for me, but be aware that there is a significant amount of rippling on this sword. I actually find it quite aesthetic. It gives it kind of a personalized and artisanal flavor, and it's certainly not enough rippling to really be noticeable when you're looking at the sword side on. So that's the first thing. Second thing, and this might be more significant for some people, although I don't mind it, and I'll explain why. You may notice, if I show you the sword like this, that the grip is not straight in line with the blade. It's actually tilted slightly in that direction. But it's almost straight, so the grip tapers down here. The bottom edge is pretty much straight in line with the rest of the blade, and this edge therefore curves down quite a bit more significantly. So that's an asymmetry in the grip, which I actually like, because it means that it changes the feel, the movement, and the functionality of the sword somewhat, depending on which edge you choose to use as your true edge, and which edge you choose to use as your false edge. So if I hold the sword, so here the grip is tilted somewhat downwards, so if I hold the sword like this, that means that the grip is functions somewhat like a pistol grip. It actually makes it's easier to have the point in a almost straight line with my arm. And it also means that it's slightly easier for me as I turn the sword to push into the grip. So it changes the nature of binds a little bit, and theoretically it would also affect the nature of the cut somewhat, where the cut would be more pushed into the target as opposed to slashing through it. Somewhat like the effect of a kukri or something like that, but of course very subtly. If, however, I choose to hold it in the opposite direction, so now the grip is going upwards somewhat. Now if I hold it like this, the blade is tilted somewhat backwards in my hand, which gives slightly more of a saber-like effect in the cuts. And it's a significant enough difference that you actually feel it aiding in edge alignment when you hold it like this. The same kind of effect that you get with a saber, especially near the tip, where because of that curve in the grip, it actually kind of wants to pull the sword into its proper edge alignment as it impacts a target. So those effects are subtle, but they are there, and that means that you have basically still a bit more versatility with the sword. But those of you who would want a perfectly straight grip, be aware that the individual sword I got was not perfectly straight. That might just be an unusual quirk with this individual sword. I'm not sure. Like I said, I'm actually pretty happy with that. Alright, so I mentioned the blade, very good, other than the rippling might bother some people. The grip, very good, very nice. It's got a nice taper in both directions, tapers down here, so it's very comfortable and very easy to align the blade. Crossguard is very sharp and clean, very well executed. The pommel is particularly nice, particularly cleanly executed. The tang goes through the grip and the pommel and is pinned at the back here, and I bet you can hardly see the difference. You can hardly see that there is a tang there, but I assure you there is one. I can see it, but you can hardly see it on camera. But it's been pinned down and then polished very nicely, so this is very sharp, clean lines, very appealing shape to the pommel. Same with the crossguard, very, very nicely executed. I actually can't show you anymore the fit of the crossguard because I've filled up the gaps with beeswax so that I don't have to worry about water sliding down the blade and going into the grip when I'm cutting water bottles. But I think you can find pictures of this online, and from memory the grip was pretty tight along the thickest part of the blade and along the width, but there were some gaps where the blade thins out toward the edge on all of the sides. So that's just something to be aware of. But the fit was really pretty good, and as I said, sorry I can't show you that unless I remove the beeswax, which I don't want to do. So, okay, so now we get to the reason I'm making this video and my biggest complaint, which is pretty minor because, as I said, it's easy to fix and I'm going to fix it, but just to be aware, this is how my sword came in. So the sword is, the grip here has, I think it's a wooden grip, but it's got a cord wrap on it and then leather covering that cord. Now up here, I don't know if you can see, I'm going to remove my glove, there is some cord missing here and here. And so that cord not being tightly fit together, but having been wrapped too fast and having some big gaps here, means that it has very quickly loosened up in my hand. Perhaps not enough glue was used, I'm not sure, but when the cord is nice and tight together, not that much glue is needed because it just kind of holds together from the pressure of it. But when the cord is isolated here from gaps, that means that it can start moving, and this leather has gotten loose and the cord underneath is also loose and it rolls around. In fact, I think you can see a bit of the wood, the grip right there. There is also a bit of motion, a bit of a gap and a bit of motion on the other side, although less significant. But so if I don't do anything about it, that's going to get worse, and it does already move a bit, makes the grip slightly less secure on your fingers. So I think I'm going to replace this grip. I think I'm just going to cut off the leather, cut off the cord, wrap new cord around it nice and tight, full, and then either reuse this piece of leather or get a new one. I've got some scraps of black leather, and glue that back over using cord, a second layer of cord on the outside of the leather to get it nice and tight and get this shape with little ridges. So I've actually made a grip like this before on a synthetic sword, which I don't have anymore, but it was pretty easy to do. And I have cord wrapped a lot of synthetic swords, so I just haven't added the leather, but like this, for example, which is really easy to do with some cord and glue. Just wrap it around and it sticks just fine. So I'm gonna have to do the same thing with leather. So that really, the issue with the grip is my personal biggest complaint with this sword, but as I said, it's easily remedied, and that's what I'm going to do. And when you have the ability to remake a grip wrap like this, it also leaves me the option to customize it a little bit, although I like it the way it is, but I might consider putting in a riser or two or another customization. But overall, really great sword. I'm very happy with it, and I would absolutely recommend this. Oh yeah, one last thing, I didn't mention the sharpening. So I got this sharp. I touched up one of the edges, but just to remove the micro secondary bevel, but it came very sharp. So this bottom edge is the factory edge, and I have already used it quite a bit, but it's still quite sharp. I mean, toward the tip, yeah, it's good enough. It's lost some sharpness toward the tip. The other edge, I have sharpened up and is even sharper. So, really nice edges. This sword is, depending on how it comes, it might not be as sharp, but if it's not, it's very easy to get it extremely sharp, to get very nice edges on this. So yeah, really nice thing. Go get yourself one if you're into this kind of sword. Oh yeah, I forgot. Last thing I was going to mention, minor detail about the sharpness. The edges came very sharp, but the point was not properly sharpened. And so I touched that up myself with a first a file and then a sharpening stone, or a few sharpening stones actually, just to get the point really sharp enough to bite. I don't like the edges of a blade being sharpened till about here and then having a blunt point. That just makes thrusting a lot harder, especially when you have a nice point like this. It's nice to get the very tip so that it bites into things very easily, and then if the edges after that sharp tip are also sharp and biting, that will make thrusting very easy. So yeah, that's it. Really nice thing. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.